how to fit a lift kit and what are some of the biggest tyres you can get on without spacers. Today I'm fitting a 40mm spring lift kit from Muddymods, and also at the same time changing into these mud/all-terrain tyres. MT51s these are, Kumho ones, quite reasonably priced and nicely aggressive. Fitting the lift kit involves putting these spacers, so I've gone to 40mm as a bit of a compromise. Should be enough for what I want to use it for. Nicely made, these ones. They're nicely aligned between top and bottom, and slightly different between the front and the rear. So this is the front one, closed top, and that's the rear one. So to get ready, you also want to jack up your car, put it on axle stands to keep it secure. You'll have to remove the struts, and I've already done one side. You need to get access to these 3 nuts at the top of each strut. So the water tank, I've got a different water tank's been moved over, so it's quite easy on that one. See, the spacer's already fitted with a closed top. This side is slightly complicated by the fuse box you've got in the way, so take off the lid, remove these, what are they, 10mm nuts or so, 3 of them, I believe there and over there. So you don't actually need to remove these power connectors. It's probably wise to disconnect the battery if you're worried about shorting out, just in case. But you can then lever that up enough, and this cover that sits on top of the strut needs pulling off to get access to those nuts on the top of that strut. You have to take the 2 bolts and nuts off the bottom of the strut. One of them you really want to take off anyhow to put the camber adjusting bolt on, which comes with this kit, which is this thing here that replaces the top bolt and nut on the strut, the top of the 2. You can do it without removing this steering arm track rod end ball joint. Often those are a bit of a pain in the arse to get off because they're probably quite rusted on, but you can leave it on, and it's just about enough movement to get the strut in and out, and just leave it semi-dangling in position off the steering arm. For the rear of the vehicle, to get access to the top of the strut, which is, as you can see here, there's the nuts, one slightly around the back there. You obviously have to take that plastic side panel off, which is there, and to get that off, you also have to take this bottom panel off. That's held in place by 6 T20 screws, so you need one of these universal screwdriver sets, or just a T20 if you want to just do that. Then you can just lever it out of the way, release it from the rubber seals. Don't need to take that other panel off by the side. You do need to take these little clips off, these luggage clips, which just twist by, I think, yeah, 90 degrees, and then just pull out. So at the same time as doing the lift kit, I'm going to fit these larger off-road tyres. I did quite a lot of research on sizes. I think this is one of the largest sizes you can get on, with a diameter of 29.4 inches, and it is a Kumho 225/70R17. They're quite good reviews, and you can see it's quite a lot larger diameter than standard. Even these standard tyres was a little bit over what is normal. So let's get the wheel off and get on with it. First we have to get some of these pipes out of the way. This is the ABS wire that just pulls off, and then the brake hose. Let's get a screwdriver. It's got a little clip here at the end of my screwdriver. Just slide that off. Probably a bit rusty. Might need to knock it off. See, that is a little spring clip thing that holds the brake pipe on the bracket. And it should just slide out from under and then get the pipe through the gap. And that's all you need to do with the brake pipes. The tricky ones, as you can see here, are these 2 bolts and nuts. This side is an 18mm head to it, I believe. That's an 18. Let's just see if that fits. Yep, there's a lot of crud around it. This side actually feels like a 21, because when it's got a lot of crud on it, what's a 21? That one, I think, yeah, 21 seems to fit reasonably well, but because it's got so much rust on it, it's actually hiding the fact, I think, that it is a 20, because I tended to round off some of the nuts and that 20, if we tap it on to get rid of all the crud, actually fits okay. And I measured it with a caliper, and seems to be closer to 20 than 21. So just be careful you don't round off these nuts, because it requires a hell of a lot of torque to get these nuts off. What I'd recommend is spraying with a bit of WD-40 penetrating spray or penetrating oil or the like. Then get a power bar on your socket, something like this sort of arrangement, big long power bar. You have to put a hell of a lot of weight onto it getting that on. I couldn't actually shift it with the power bar, and I did therefore invest in, if you think about one of these ranges, an impact wrench. This is a DeWalt one, quite expensive. You could rent one of these or borrow one. This gives out 950 newton meters of torque, but even this shifted the top one, wouldn't shift the bottom one. What I managed to shift it with the other side is using a blowtorch to heat the socket and the nut. Be careful where you direct this. You don't want to direct it anywhere near the rubber gaiter or too much on the strut or anywhere near brake pipes. Eventually, with a lot of heating, the power bar shifted it, and then you can remove the bolts, tap them out if need be. Like so. Next we've got to remove the anti-roll bar nuts, which is this one. You'll probably need to get a socket and wrench on it, so that's a 19mm socket. And if you get a 17mm spanner on the other side like here, jam it against the lower suspension arm, then that gives you plenty of leverage and grip to get off that quite tight nut, which if it hasn't been removed for a long time, like mine, it's going to be quite a problem. And in order to release that anti-roll bar joint, you probably just have to relieve the tension on the roll bar. So now we've got the top nuts off the strut, these bolts undone, everything disconnected. Just got to be a little bit careful we don't knock or overstretch the brake pipe. And then we can detach the strut with a bit of wiggling. Look after your drive shaft gaiter as well. That's detached. What does help is to put the steering on full right hand lock this side now. So at this stage we can either put on some spring compressors to bring the strut height down a bit so we can clear the top of the wheel arch, or you can try and remove the ball joint. Over the years I've managed to break about 3 of my tools, so I'm going to use some spring compressors, squash that down a bit, and hopefully that will allow me to remove or clear the top of the strut. With most of the spring compressed, top of the strut you can just push down a little bit, and then you can clear the top of the arch, and you've then got enough room just to have it dangling off the steering arm. Just check the strut out, the bearing's okay, seems to be okay, and then we can put our extender plate on the top there. The other thing we need to do is cut a little bit of metal, a little triangle out of there, that sort of shape. I'm going to use a angle grinder for that, with a thin 1mm thin stainless steel cutting blade. Oh, you could use a hacksaw or anything you've got. Something like that from the other side. In fact, I think I need to cut a little bit more off that. I've had some people say you don't need to cut the metal for a 40mm lift, but looking at this you certainly do. But I think you can get away with just cutting it close to where the main part of the chassis is. So fix any rusts that's on your strut, then fix our lift kit, 40mm in this case, and fit the supplied washers and lock nuts, 3 of them all the way around, and the original nuts of course will go on the top. And then refitting is a stroke reversal. This is where it comes in handy having that little cutout done before this stage, because it allows it to lower a little bit, and if the springs are compressed sufficiently then that should clear inside the top there, mind your fingers. Alright, once you've got one bolt through, get a nut on, hold it in place. What we need to do now get the strut lined up with the holes, you'll sort of have a little screwdriver so that when you can see a little bit of hole alignment, you can pull it into place. There we go, let's get the screwdriver through. Gives you a bit of leverage. You get one of the bottom bolts, and then we should, with a bit of manipulating with the screwdriver, looking at how the hole aligns, get it to the right position. There we go. For that bolt, just tap all the way through, and that's fairly secure. So now we have to fit our top camber adjusting bolts, this one here, and basically the way it adjusts the camber is, you can see this lobe moves around the shaft up or down as the bolt rotates, and that has the effect. This lobe sits on this inner part, this outer washer with the tab on it sits in the outer strut part, and the relationship of these two adjusts the camber, because basically this lobe moves this top bit in and out with respect to this, which is the camber adjustment. But as I say, to get it on, you have to align that tab on to the lobe, and we'll do that now. Let's just push this in, these out of the way, and they suggest starting off with negative camber, which is this tab pointing to the inside of the car, and adjusting either the tab position or the lobe position, or both, adjusts the camber. You'll get the hang of it as you are basically looking at it as you rotate the bolt, and you need some method of measuring the camber, of course. So I believe that should be it. So make sure this washer is flush with the surface, which it is, which means that little tab is in the hole of the strut. And we just put the nut on so you can see the camber adjusting. You might just see, let's zoom in on that little crack. So adjust the bolt, see it move a little fraction. So that's where they're all fitted back, and it's at this point I'm glad I only went for a 40mm rather than a 50mm lift, because on the extreme lock, see there, the steering arm, despite having cut a lot of the metal back virtually flush with the chassis, and to cut any more you'd have to substantially go into that box section, so I opened up a little hole just into that box section, which I'll just put a bit of filler over. Could be welded, but I don't think it structurally matters too much. But you can imagine if I had another 1 centimetre off, that would be quite a problem and require some cutting and re-welding into that box section. And as it is, I've rotated the end of the steering arm slightly. So yeah, 40mm, it's probably best to stick to that if you don't want to do too much cutting and welding. And even with the 40mm, there's a fair bit cut off there. So test it all out at the extremes of different lock. And there you can see with this tyre, there is just enough room without rubbing. That's about maybe 4 or 5mm. That, I think, is probably the maximum that you're going to get in terms of tyre size, unless you fit spacers. Trouble with spacers is the wheel then comes out more, which of course gives the car a nice stance, but it might start to get closer to this edge. That's not a problem. This side is a little bit closer, so I've already cut a little bit off this mud flap just to make it look a bit better all the way around here. It didn't quite rub, but it was very, very close. But you can imagine if we had a big spacer on here, the tyre is going to come more in this direction, so it's going to get closer and closer to this part of the mud flap. Most people take the mud flaps off, of course, but if you're off-roading, it's quite nice to minimise the amount of stones and mud being chucked on your bodywork. So that's the type of camber adjusting bolt, the 14mm by 70 that's appropriate for this car, and the torque setting that you tighten it to is 70 pound-foot. The torque for the remaining structure hub nuts and bolts from the Haynes manual is 151 pound-foot. On the rear strut, here's the spacer. And again, we have to remove the strut. And again, these bolts going through were a little bit of a problem to remove, but they did shift eventually with power bar and my impact driver. Temporarily held the strut in position just with a couple of screwdrivers going through the open holes, because there is one problem on the rear strut, and that is we've got to disconnect the brake pipe, and it won't just unclip because the brake hose actually goes through a hole on a plate on the strut that's welded onto the strut. So we've got to disconnect that on both sides, which means we've got to disconnect the hose. So we're going to have to clamp off the hose to stop all the fluid coming out. And one of the problems I found, and you might find on your car as well, if it's a bit old, this is a 2003 model, is these bleed nuts were a bit corroded, rounded off. This just wouldn't undo. Got rounded off even despite some sockets and all sorts of wrenches on it. I think this one was also a problem, and that one did undo okay. That I had to use a wrench on. Can't also undo the bolts that hold the cylinder on, so what we're going to have to do is change this as a set. So new cylinder, new brake pipe, new brake hose, and just use a disc cutter, angle grinder. I think I can just get a blade in there, cut the whole lot off on the back of the plates, cut through the bolts, and then just pull it out. So I've got the new parts on the way. Something like £5 and £10 each for each of the cylinder, brake pipe and hose. I'll put links in the video description for some of those items on eBay. To get to the brakes and set the cylinder off, you have to of course take the drum off. That's held on after you've taken of course the nuts and the wheel off by a couple of these little screws. And you have to try and, well, first of all, release the handbrake as much as you can. That's usually enough to get a couple of screwdrivers, get it under the drum, both sides, and lever it off. And it came off with a little bit of persuasion on this one. If it's really stuck, you'll have to get into where the handbrake goes into the centre glove box and slacken off the handbrake cable a bit more to relax the pads, enables you to take the drum off. So here's the strut on the inside, nuts are all undone, ready to drop down, the tension is released. One point worth mentioning is I did try to see if I could compress the spring, so I had about 4 spring compressors on it. I could compress the spring a lot, so it would go all the way down to about this sort of height, springs very nearly touching, took a lot of effort, and I had to keep swapping in and out spring compressors. But the trouble is, still not enough height to actually get a spacer in at the top of the strut. I wanted to try and avoid having to change the brake pipe since I couldn't get the bolts off. But the strut itself, apart from the spring, is actually sprung loaded. So it was quite difficult to push the top of the strut down, and would have been virtually impossible to push it down enough to get the spacer in and do up the nuts. So I had to resort to getting lots of brake parts and taking the strut off. So that's the cutting done, as you can see here. Quickest way to get this cylinder off. None of these bolts would undo, and you can just about get a 4.5 inch disc cutter in there, and then prise off the cylinder to leave any last bits of the bolt behind. And that's the amount of cutting you had to do. The new one fortunately comes with a new bleed nipple. Doesn't come with the bolts to retain it, so you need to pick up a couple of these, I think they're M6 by 10 bolts from eBay. Again, see buying links in description. And you can, if you pop in the cylinders, which push in very easily, you can just put the new one in, and there's very little disturbing of the brake pads, so you might be able to get the drum back on without having to readjust the brakes or back off the adjuster, hopefully. Once you've disconnected the brake pipes, clamp them off, put them out of the way, you can take the strut off, and here's the spacer fitted to the top of that. Don't forget to refit the plastic cap that originally came with, and my little tip is to put a bit of sealant around the top as well, because any water coming up from the bottom from off-roading. You don't really want getting into the cabin area. And here's a nice new brake cylinder fitted, and it's worthwhile buying these ones. These are from eBay. Only I think under 10 quid for 2 pipes left and right. Not really worth making your own when you can buy them that cheap. And the new hoses to go on. So now just a matter of assembling. And of course, don't forget to bleed the brakes afterwards. Here's a few tips so you can learn from my experience. It's useful to have one of these hose pipe clamps, and then you can minimise the amount of fluid loss from the pipe. To minimise fluid loss, I like to get a bit of cellophane, put it under the cap of the brake reservoir, and then if you do have a leak, it'll minimise the fluid loss because it'll create a vacuum and won't want to fall out of the master reservoir. The other tool that's good to have is a Posi-Drive number 3 screwdriver for these little screws that hold the hub on, because they're big size. If it's anything like mine, there'll be a lot of rust around parts, and if somebody has previously tried to get these nuts off without using the right tools, then probably the edges will be rounded off. If they're not, make sure you use good tools. These spanners are quite useful with a 10mm and 11mm end. You can see it grabs the nut on at least 4 sides, 4 and a bit, but also goes over the brake pipe to use that little gap in the end. Obviously somebody didn't have that before, and all this nut is all rounded off, so I have no choice but to use this like sterling wrench to grab onto it, and to do that I'm going to have to move it out from the chassis a little bit. These hoses are held on by these little spring clips. To remove them, this one at least, probably want to get a screwdriver in, lever it off, and that's the other thing you want to replace, because I suspect they're probably all a bit rusty. 1 or 2 of these, the other side are all broken. Get these on eBay as well, so hopefully those will arrive tomorrow, some nice stainless steel ones. There's another one retaining the hose on this side, just see it at the bottom there, and there you can get a screwdriver on it, whack it on the end with a hammer to knock it off. Once you've released the clip, you'll probably still find the hose is pretty well jammed in to the plate. This one certainly is, just due to rust and corrosion. So next tool is useful to have is one of these type wrenches, which are adjustable, because you can then use that to squash between the top of the pipe and the plate to basically push it down, and eventually you'll get it out. That was quite useful. I did manage to remove the cylinder on the other side and put the new one in place without disturbing the brake pads, so the position wasn't out. When it came to fitting the drum, with a gentle even tapping both sides, it was possible to refit the drum without disturbing the brakes, which is handy because they'll be fully adjusted and the brakes will be the same as normal. Just make sure they don't bind when you assemble the drum. The last tip is when you reassemble the strut, don't forget to have your ABS cable. These clip onto plates either side here, one around the back. On the other side, I made the mistake of not checking the ABS cable before I put the strut on. The bolt holding the sensor on was well rusted, so I just strapped it onto this side of the strut instead. I don't think it's a big issue. It's not going anywhere and it's not going to wear against anything. Next time I change the sensor, I'll put it back into the proper position. So learn from my mistake, and no comments about bodging, please. If you can detach the hose from the plate, and then you can wiggle the pipe a little bit lower down, and then you've got a lot more room for getting some good wrenches onto that awkward nut, and you can then undo it. If it's not serviceable for future use, then of course you'll have to change this brake pipe as well, which goes up into the bodywork a bit more, so a little bit more tricky. That's the gap between the strut and the rear tyre to the edges. Nothing needed trimming off on the plastic there. It looks fairly reasonable, and the tyre's nice and aggressive. On the front there was little bits of plastic on the inner wheel arch I had to trim off, which you'll find as you put the wheel on full lock. A few millimetres I trimmed off the mud guard. That's the gap, about 4 or 5 mil between the tyre and the strut, which is fine. And you can adjust that with your camber setting, of course. And that's the lift kit all fully fitted, 40 mil. The bigger, more off-road tyres, 225 70 by 17. There's a 17-inch original Land Rover wheels, 6 spokes, and got the rock slider on. I'll do a separate video on that later. One thing is useful to do now is to check and adjust the wheel tracking, the alignment, toe in, toe out. So for that, this Gunson track right is pretty useful. You can of course go to a tyre shop, get them to do it, but that's quite accurate because it actually shows any forces that are acting on the tyre due to the toe in or toe out, and you can also measure it while you're sat in the vehicle because you actually drive over the gauge, whereas in a tyre shop you're not actually sat in it. On a lifted vehicle that might make a little bit of difference because the steering arms now I don't know if you can see from here, but they slightly droop down compared to an unlifted vehicle. So the tracking will slightly change as the height of the vehicle changes, as the springs compress. So for instance now, I don't know whether you can see, but a quick way of checking for drastic misalignment is to stick something straight, like these pair of ladders, make sure they're straight. You can see here on the front wheels, there's quite a big toe out now of the front wheels, and that would be expected because the steering arms having drooped, they'll be pulling the back of the wheel in and making it toe out. So we need to adjust that first, and then once we've got the front correctly set for toe in, toe out, confirm it with the Gunson track right, adjust it equally both sides. You can use these ladders or straight edge to also roughly check the rear ones. These shouldn't be so bad because you've got equal arms on both sides of the suspension, so although it might drag a little bit more or pull in a little bit more, all that's going to do is going to increase the camber angle, but that's not too bad to start with. It's not really that noticeably off, and in fact the guy at Muddymods says you don't really need to have camber bolts on the rear ones. You can if you want, of course. And that's it. Some off-road wheels, 40mm lift, and a lot more ground clearance. There's about a foot at the sides, probably about 11 inches at the back, fraction less at the front, maybe 10 due to that engine subframe, but a lot better for off-roading and a bit of fun. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Bye.